She was standing at the supply cart when the doors blew open. Not swung, not pushed, blown, both panels slamming back against the wall hard enough to rattle the IV bags on their hooks, hard enough to make the overnight intake clerk drop her coffee. 4 men in tactical gear moved through Riverside Medical Center's emergency entrance like they owned the floor, rifles slung, radios crackling, eyes scanning every corner of the room in the practiced, unhurried way of people who have cleared much more dangerous places than a hospital at 11 p.m. Emma Hayes didn't move. 31 years old, 5'6", wearing a white nursing uniform that had a coffee stain on the left cuff she hadn't gotten around to treating. She stood at that supply cart with a roll of surgical tape in one hand and watched one of the officers sweep the room until his eyes landed on her. He didn't look confused. He didn't look like someone who had walked into the wrong building. He looked like someone who had found exactly what he came for. Every monitor in the ER screamed at once. A coincidence, a run of bad luck, 3 patients hitting alarm thresholds inside the same 30-second window, and in the chaos of nurses running and doctors calling out orders, Emma and that officer stared at each other across a crowded trauma bay. He knew something. She could see it in the set of his jaw. And whatever it was about to change everything. 6 hours earlier, Emma had been doing what she always did on a Wednesday night shift, keeping her head down, doing her job, and pretending she didn't notice the way Dr. Philip Grantham talked to her in front of patients. Hayes. He said her name the way some people say obviously, flat, slightly contemptuous, carrying the implication that she should already know she'd done something wrong. He was 44, chief of emergency medicine, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been seriously questioned. He came around the curtain of Bay 3 and looked at the chart she was holding, then at her, then at the chart again. Why is the Metcalf patient still on the heparin drip? Because his last PT/INR came back at 1.4, and Dr. Osei ordered it continued pending the repeat labs, Emma said. She kept her voice even. She'd had a lot of practice keeping her voice even. The repeat is due in... Dr. Osei ordered it before we had the full picture. Grantham took the chart from her hands without asking. I'm discontinuing it. Emma hesitated. She knew she should let it go. 3 years at Riverside Medical had taught her exactly where the ceiling was for a staff nurse questioning a department chief, and she'd bumped her head on it enough times to know the shape of it by heart. But the Metcalf patient was 62, post-op day 2 from a FEMPOP bypass, and the heparin wasn't incidental. It was the thing standing between him and a graft occlusion. Dr. Grantham, she said carefully, the surgical team flagged him as high thrombosis risk. If we pull the drip before the repeat labs confirm, I'm aware of what the surgical team flagged. He was already writing on the chart, not looking at her. You're a nurse, Hayes. Document what I order. I understand that. I'm just saying that the protocol for post-bypass patients in this window specifically... He looked up. The look was short and thorough, the kind that was meant to make you feel small. You're just a nurse, he said. Stay in your lane. He said it quietly, which was almost worse than if he'd said it loud. Quiet meant he didn't think she was worth raising his voice at. Quiet meant she wasn't a threat worth acknowledging. She was furniture that had briefly developed opinions about the room. Emma stood there for 1 second, 2, and then she said, I'm going to document my clinical concern in the patient notes. Grantham shrugged and handed the chart back. Document whatever makes you feel better. Just make sure you execute the order. She did. She documented it carefully, precisely, in the measured clinical language she'd learned to use as a kind of armor. Nurse expressed concern. Early discontinuation of anticoagulation therapy in high-risk post-bypass patient. Physician aware. Order executed per MD instruction. She had a whole internal vocabulary for these moments. Language that meant I told you so, in writing, at this exact time without ever saying it out loud. The Metcalf patient was fine, as it turned out. His repeat labs came back clean and the graft held. She didn't get credit for raising the concern. She never did. The hospital had a particular social architecture that Emma had mapped out in her first month and never stopped noticing since. Riverside Medical Center was 12 floors of pale brick and reflective glass sitting on the eastern edge of Silver Creek, the kind of mid-sized city that called itself a community and meant it about 40% of the time. The hospital had 308 beds, a level 2 trauma designation, and an administration that had, in Emma's assessment, spent the better part of a decade confusing the appearance of quality with quality itself. At the top of the architecture was hospital administrator Clifton Marsh. He was 51, silver-haired, perpetually dressed in suits that cost more than Emma's monthly rent, and he moved through the hospital like a man who was always on his way to something more important than where he currently was. He had plaques on his wall and quotas in his head, and a way of talking about patient outcomes that made it sound like something that happened to revenue projections. Below Marsh came the department chiefs, Grantham in emergency, Dr. Sylvia Pratt in surgery, Dr. Roland Keyes in administration and compliance. Below them, attending physicians. Below them, residents. Below them, a long drop, and then nurses. Nurses were the people who noticed when something was wrong. Nurses were also the people least likely to be listened to when they said so. Emma had figured this out early. She'd adjusted. She did her job with a precision and a competence that she kept mostly quiet, because quiet was what got you through a shift without becoming a problem someone needed to manage. She made friends carefully. Dara Okonkwo, a charge nurse who had been at Riverside longer than almost anyone and had the institutional memory of a place that had outlasted 3 administrations. Miguel Castillo, an ER tech who could stabilize a scene with one hand and diffuse a combative patient with the other. She kept to herself about the rest. "You should say something," Dara told her once, back in November, after a particularly visible incident in which Grantham had corrected Emma's assessment of a pediatric patient's respiratory presentation in front of the child's mother, loudly, in a way that was less about clinical accuracy and more about establishing dominance. He'd been right about the diagnosis as it happened, but wrong about the mechanism. Emma's read on the underlying trigger had been correct, which the attending allergist confirmed 4 hours later. Nobody mentioned it. "Say something to who?" Emma asked. Dara thought about it. "Fair point," she finally said. That was November. By February, things had gotten worse. The incident that ended Emma's employment at Riverside Medical Center happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and it was, at its core, about a child named Abby Wren. Abby was 7 years old, brought in by her grandmother with a fever of 103.4 and a rash that the grandmother described as appearing all at once, like a sunburn that came from inside. Emma had triaged her within 10 minutes of arrival, and something about the presentation had put a cold wire of attention through her chest that she recognized and didn't ignore. The rash was petechial, small, pinpoint, dark red, and it didn't blanch when she pressed a glass against it. She knew what non-blanching petechiae meant. She knew what it meant in combination with a high fever and a child who had been, according to the grandmother, fine at breakfast and wrong by lunch. She put Abby on the highest priority and went to find whoever was running the floor. That turned out to be Dr. Roland Keyes, who was covering for a sick attending and was not, in Emma's private and carefully undisclosed opinion, someone who should have been covering anything more complex than paperwork. "I need you to look at this patient," Emma said. She had the chart. She had her assessment notes. 7-year-old, fever, non-blanching rash. "I think we need to rule out meningococcal septicemia before we do anything else." Keyes looked at the chart. He looked at it the way people look at things they've already decided aren't important. Temperature's elevated but not critical. Rash could be viral. Let's get a CBC and see where we land. "Dr. Keyes, the rash is non-blanching. I heard you, Hayes." He handed the chart back. "We'll do the blood work." "The blood work takes time we might not have. If this is what I think it is, we need ceftriaxone now, not after labs." "You think?" He said it like she'd made a grammatical error. "Run the labs. If the picture changes, we reassess." Emma stood very still. There was a version of herself that would have walked away at this point, documented it, covered herself, let the process work the way the process was supposed to work. But Abby Wren was 7 years old, and her grandmother was in the waiting room with her hands clasped together too tight, and the cold wire in Emma's chest had become a sustained alarm. "I'd like this documented as a formal clinical disagreement," Emma said. "Excuse me?" "I'm formally disagreeing with the treatment plan. I want it in the chart." Keyes stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked away. Emma documented it anyway. She was still documenting it when Clifton Marsh appeared at the nursing station, which meant Keyes had called him, which meant this had escalated in the time it took her to finish a paragraph. Hayes. Marsh's voice was different from Grantham's. Smoother, less contemptuous, more careful. He was the kind of person who had learned to perform reasonableness so thoroughly that he sometimes forgot it was a performance. Step into my office. I have a patient I'm concerned about. The Wren child. Yes. Dr. Keyes mentioned your concerns. He said your concerns the way you might say your hobby. Emma, I understand you feel strongly, but we have a clinical hierarchy for a reason. Dr. Keyes is the attending of record. I understand the hierarchy. I'm asking for a second opinion. That's not your call to make. The patient is 7 years old. The rash is... Emma. His voice dropped, still smooth. This is not the first time you've created friction with attending physicians over clinical decisions that fall outside your scope. We've had conversations about this. They had. She remembered each one. I'm asking you, Emma said carefully, to make sure someone with appropriate authority reviews this child's presentation before we commit to a watch-and-wait approach. Marsh looked at her for a moment, a measuring look, a calculating one, and she could see him weighing something she couldn't quite read. Then he said, I'm going to have to put you on administrative leave pending a review of today's conduct. The words landed with a physical weight. You're suspending me. Administrative leave, pending review. He kept his voice gentle, which was the most insulting part. Please turn in your badge at the desk. Security will escort you out. And the patient? Is in the care of the attending physician. Emma stood there for 2 seconds. 3. Then she turned around, went to the supply cart, picked up the chart she'd been holding, and wrote one final note in precise, unhurried clinical language. She documented every detail of Abby Wren's presentation, every symptom, every response, the time of each interaction with the attending, the specific recommendation she had made, and the specific response she'd received. Then she handed the chart to Dara, who was watching from across the nursing station with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. Make sure someone sees that, Emma said quietly. Dara took the chart without a word. The security guard was young, mid-20s, uncomfortable with the task, and he didn't say anything as he walked her to the lobby. Emma didn't make it easier for him. She collected her bag from her locker, clipped her badge to the security desk with a sound that was more final than she'd intended, and walked out through the glass doors into a February evening that was gray and cold and smelled like coming rain. She sat in her car for a while. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that early on when she'd first understood what kind of place she'd landed in. She'd used it up somewhere around the 4th month. She turned the heat on and drove home. 2 things happened in the next 18 hours. The first, Abby Wren was transferred to the ICU at 9 p.m. that same evening with a confirmed diagnosis of meningococcal septicemia. She was started on ceftriaxone, exactly the drug Emma had flagged, and spent 5 days in intensive care before being stabilized. She would recover fully, which was the outcome that mattered, and which was also a near thing that didn't have to be as near as it was. Emma found out through Dara, who texted her at 10:17 p.m. with a message that was just, "You were right. Kids in ICU wanted you to know." Emma read it twice and then set her phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a while. The second thing that happened was quieter and stranger. At 2 a.m., she got a call from an unidentified number. She almost didn't answer. Late-night unknown calls were never good, but something made her pick up. Silence on the line. Then, "Emma Hayes?" A male voice, low and precise. "Who is this?" "Someone who needs to confirm you're available." A pause. "There may be a situation developing. We may need your skill set." She sat up. "I'm sorry, what skill set? Who am I speaking with?" But the call was already dead. She held the phone for a long time after that. Skill set. Not nursing, not medical experience. Skill set. There was only one context in which that word meant what she thought it meant. She put the phone down and didn't sleep. The next evening, her second night off, officially suspended, waiting for a review process that Marcia's email had suggested could take up to 3 weeks. Emma drove to the hospital out of something she couldn't name. Not to go in. She knew she couldn't go in. She just ended up in the parking lot, engine running, watching the lights in the emergency bay. She'd been at Riverside for 3 years, and she'd spent most of it being smaller than she was. Quieter. More contained. She'd had reasons for that. Good reasons. Clinical reasons. Reasons she kept in a locked mental compartment that she rarely opened. The version of herself that had been an Army combat medic attached to a special operations unit in a country she'd agreed never to publicly name was a version she'd retired deliberately, carefully, and on terms she'd negotiated herself. She hadn't come to Silver Creek to be a hero. She'd come to be invisible. She was watching the ambulance bay when the call came in on the hospital scanner she kept in her car. A habit, not a strategy. And she heard the phrase gunshot wounds. Multiple. Government contractor and the words critical, unresponsive, and then an estimated ETA of 4 minutes. She was already reaching for the door handle before she'd consciously decided anything. Okay, she was standing at the supply cart. She'd walked in through the ambulance entrance. Nobody stopped her. The badge system hadn't been updated yet when the ER doors blew open. Not the ambulance doors. The main ER entrance. Both panels slamming back. 4 men in tactical gear moved through the space with the particular economy of people who've done this before, in worse places. Rifles slung, but not slung casually. Radios active, eyes moving. The ER was already in controlled chaos from a rush of cases, 2 MVAs, a pediatric fever, an elderly man with chest pain in Bay 4, and the arrival of armed personnel added a layer of something that wasn't quite panic but was adjacent to it. The overnight intake clerk knocked her coffee onto the floor. A resident coming around the corner from radiology stopped short and pressed himself against the wall. The officer in front was mid-40s, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, built like someone who didn't spend much time at desks. He scanned the room with the systematic thoroughness of training, and his eyes moved across the nursing station, the trauma bays, the supply area, and landed on Emma. He didn't look confused. He didn't look like someone scanning for threats and dismissing her as a civilian. He looked like someone who had a specific target and had just acquired it. Every monitor in the trauma bay chose that exact moment to alarm, 3 at once, a cascade of shrieking tones that sent 2 nurses running and a resident shouting for a crash cart. And in that sudden noise and motion, Emma and the officer stared at each other across 40 feet of linoleum. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't quite account for, that this was connected to the call at 2 a.m., that whoever he was, he hadn't arrived here by accident. She also knew, with a different kind of certainty, that somewhere behind those ambulance doors was a patient in a condition that the Riverside ER physicians were not going to handle correctly. She straightened up, squared her shoulders. The officer said something into his radio without breaking eye contact with her. And then the ambulance doors opened and everything changed. The ambulance doors opened and the gurney came through fast, 2 paramedics running it, one of them calling out vitals in the clipped, breathless rhythm of someone who had been calling out vitals for the past 12 minutes and was running out of good news to report. Male, approximately 40, multiple GSWs, 2 to the left lateral thorax, 1 to the right shoulder, 1 grazed to the neck. BP 60 over palp, heart rate 142 and climbing, O2 sat 78 on high flow. He's been in and out since pickup, lost him once in the rig, got him back. The ER charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Terrence, who Emma had worked beside for 2 years, moved to intercept the gurney on instinct, then pulled up short when he registered the tactical personnel fanning out around the bay. "What is—" "Get your trauma team," one of the officers said. Not a request. Terrence turned and started shouting names. Emma moved without deciding to move. She was at the gurney before the paramedics had finished transferring the patient to the trauma bay table, and she had her hands on him before anyone told her she could. One hand finding the wound site on the left lateral thorax, the other pressing 2 fingers to the carotid to get her own read on the pulse. It was there. Thready and fast and wrong in a particular way she recognized from a context nobody in this building would have expected her to have. The patient was dark-haired, maybe 42, 43, with the kind of build that came from serious physical maintenance and the kind of injuries that came from not being far enough away from something very bad. His shirt had been cut away in the rig. 3 of the 4 wounds were visible. The shoulder entry was relatively clean, the neck graze was ugly but superficial, and the 2 lateral thorax wounds were the problem. She could see the problem without touching it. The left side of his chest was moving wrong, not the rattling, bubbling wrongness of a hemothorax, though that was likely too. Something more mechanical. The intercostal muscles on the left were barely contributing. He was breathing on the right and compensating badly. She pressed carefully along the lateral chest wall and felt what she'd feared. Tension pneumothorax. Developing. Not fully evolved yet, but the trajectory was clear, and the trajectory ended in cardiac arrest within, she calculated quickly, 8 to 12 minutes if nothing changed. Dr. Grantham arrived. Of course it was Grantham. He was the chief of emergency medicine, and it was his department, and he came in with the particular velocity of someone who had been paged with the word tactical and had made assumptions about what that would mean for his resume. He took one look at the patient, one look at the officers positioned around the bay, and his posture shifted into the performance mode she'd watched him adopt for difficult cases. Chest out, voice carrying, the bearing of a man making decisions. Okay, let's move. Trauma activation. Get me a chest x-ray, bilateral IVs. Push 2 liters saline. He doesn't have time for a chest x-ray, Emma said. Grantham turned. He registered her presence with visible surprise that curdled almost immediately into something harder. Hayes, you're suspended. You need to leave this. His left chest is not moving symmetrically. Trachea's shifting right. He has a tension pneumo developing, and you have maybe 10 minutes before it arrests him. She kept her voice flat and precise and looked him directly in the eye. Order a needle decompression now, or let me do it. You don't have clinical authority in this, doctor. The officer who had made eye contact with Emma across the bay stepped forward. He was close enough now that she could read his rank insignia, Lieutenant Colonel, and the name tape on his chest, Rourke. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Listen to her. Grantham looked at Rourke. Something in Rourke's expression, or maybe just his bearing, the absolute absence of any inclination to negotiate, made the next few seconds move differently than they might have otherwise. Fine, Grantham said. Hayes. The word came out like it cost him something. Walk me through what you're seeing. She was already reaching for the supply tray. I'll do better than that. Needle decompression wasn't a complicated procedure in theory. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, 14-gauge angiocatheter, advance until you hear the rush of air. Emma had done it 11 times in her life. 8 of those times had been in conditions significantly worse than a fully equipped trauma bay, which meant her hands were steady in a way that Grantham's, she noticed, were not quite. The rush of air came at the right moment. The patient's O2 sat, which had been sliding toward 68, stopped dropping. The tracheal deviation, visible now that she was looking for it, a subtle but definitive rightward shift, began to correct. Get me a chest tube set up, Emma said to the nearest tech. He needs a definitive drain on the left, and we need to image the right side before we assume it's clean. I'm the attending physician, Grantham said tightly. Then attend. She stepped back just slightly, giving him the space to take over the procedure while keeping herself close enough to intervene if he missed something. It was a calculated move, preserving his authority in front of his staff while making absolutely sure the patient didn't pay for the politics of the moment. Grantham stared at her for 1 second. Then he turned to the team and started giving orders that were, she noted with grim relief, the right ones. The chest tube went in. The imaging confirmed what she'd suspected. Early hemothorax on the left, right side clear for now. The blood pressure, which had been unsustainable, began a slow crawl upward as the team pushed blood products and the drainage tube did its work. The patient's heart rate came down from 142 to 118 to, eventually, 104. Not stable, not good, but not the immediate catastrophe it had been 12 minutes ago. Emma stood at the foot of the trauma bay and watched the team work and tried to think about what came next. The technical crisis was not resolved. A patient with this injury pattern needed surgical intervention, probably within the hour, and the surgical team was going to have opinions about what they found when they got in there. But the immediate precipice had been stepped back from, and that was the thing that mattered right now. Rourke appeared at her elbow. Walk with me, he said quietly. She followed him out of the trauma bay and into the corridor that ran along the side of the ER, away from the noise and the monitors and the controlled chaos of the team working the patient. He stopped when they were far enough away and turned to face her. Up close, he was older than she'd initially read, probably 48, 49, with the kind of face that had been weathered by specific kinds of stress rather than ordinary time. There was a scar along his left jawline that she recognized as old shrapnel, not surgical. "You know who he is?" Rourke said. It wasn't a question. "I know what he is," Emma said. "The wounds are consistent with someone who was in a controlled environment that stopped being controlled. 2 of the GSWs have entry angles that don't match a random attack. Someone was above him or he was below cover. The neck graze is incidental. That one wasn't aimed." Rourke looked at her for a moment. "His name is David Solis. He's a federal intelligence operative. He was running an extraction that went sideways approximately 3 hours ago." He paused. "He asked for you by name." She went still. "He doesn't know me. He knows you as Sergeant Hayes from Carvar." The word landed in her chest like something physical. She hadn't heard that name in 4 years. She'd worked very hard not to hear that name in 4 years. Carvar was a village. A valley, technically, a narrow geographic depression in a mountainous region that officially didn't exist in any operational report she'd ever been allowed to read. 14 months before she'd separated from the army, she had spent 7 hours in that valley keeping 5 people alive while waiting for extraction that had been delayed by a communications failure, and then by weather, and then by a third thing she'd never been officially told and had stopped asking about. She'd done things in that valley that she had filed away in the same locked compartment as her entire military career. Things that had worked. Things that had been necessary. Things that the Army had subsequently classified at a level that meant the events officially hadn't happened. Which was fine with Emma because she had genuinely not wanted them to have happened. "He was one of the 5, she said. "Not a question either." "No, he came in afterward. He was the debrief officer." Rourke held her gaze. "He wrote the classified commendation, the one you never received formally because the operation didn't exist officially." Emma processed this. Around them, the hospital made its ordinary sounds, distant alarms, PA system, the controlled noise of a working ER, and she stood in the corridor with this man who knew about Carvar and tried to think clearly. "Why is he here?" she asked. "In Silver Creek, why this hospital?" "That," Rourke said, "is a question with a complicated answer. The short version is that he was following something connected to this institution." He let that sit. "We've been watching Riverside Medical for 6 weeks. She looked at him. "Watching it for what?" He didn't answer immediately. In the trauma bay behind them, Grantham was calling for the surgical team, and she could hear the organized urgency of the trauma response shifting into the pre-surgical phase. Solis was alive. He was going to the OR within the hour. "Let's talk about what you saw here," Rourke said. "Before tonight, what you know about how this place operates." She talked. She hadn't planned to. She'd spent 3 years carefully not talking, carefully containing and documenting and working within whatever process was available to her. But Rourke listened in a particular way that made her realize he wasn't gathering new information so much as confirming information he already had. He asked about specific incidents. He knew the dates better than she did. He asked about the Metcalf patient. He asked about Abby Wren, by name, and the specificity of that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "How do you know about the Wren child?" she asked, "because her case appears in a pattern we've been tracking." He had a tablet out now, encrypted, she noticed, military-grade casing, and he was scrolling through something she couldn't quite see. Incidents where clinical staff raised safety concerns, were disciplined or terminated, and where the patient subsequently experienced adverse events that were documented differently in official hospital records than in the original intake notes. She processed that slowly. "You're saying the records were changed?" "I'm saying the records in at least 4 cases show significant discrepancies between initial nursing documentation and final attending sign-off. The initial notes in each case were filed by staff who were subsequently put on administrative review or terminated." He looked up from the tablet. "You filed a formal clinical disagreement on the Wren case." "Yes." "That note still exists in the system. It shouldn't, under normal document management protocols. A note like that gets reviewed and closed within 48 hours. Yours was archived differently. Someone moved it. He paused. We think that was deliberate. Someone in this hospital is preserving evidence they believe they might need later. She sat with that for a moment. Or someone is protecting themselves by having a paper trail that shows the concerns were raised. Also possible. He didn't seem troubled by the ambiguity. Either way, your documentation is part of a picture that federal investigators have been assembling for 6 weeks. What happened to you today, the suspension, accelerated a timeline we were already working. I was suspended because I pushed back on a clinical decision. She heard something hard creep into her voice and didn't try to smooth it. Not because of any federal investigation. You were suspended, Rourke said carefully, because you became a liability to people who are managing a system of concealment. Whether they knew that's what they were doing or just felt it instinctively. He shrugged slightly. The result was the same. Yet, she was still sitting with all of this when the shouting started. It came from the direction of the main ER entrance, raised voices, the specific register of institutional authority being challenged. Emma and Rourke moved together, back toward the trauma bay, and she rounded the corner to find Clifton Marsh standing at the edge of the nursing station in a suit he had clearly put on very quickly, because the collar wasn't quite right and there was something off about the jacket. He was facing 2 of Rourke's officers, and his voice had lost its characteristic smoothness. This is a hospital, Marsh was saying. You cannot simply deploy armed personnel in a clinical environment without... Mr. Marsh. Rourke's voice was quiet in a way that filled the room. Step back, please. Marsh turned. He saw Rourke. Then he saw Emma standing beside Rourke in a suspended nurse's uniform in his emergency room, looking at him from behind the shoulder of a man with a lieutenant colonel's insignia and tactical gear. Something shifted in Marsh's face. Not guilt. Not yet. Not visibly. But something that adjacent to recognition. The look of a person who has been running a calculation in the back of their mind for a long time and just heard the number come up wrong. Hayes. His voice had found its smoothness again, but it was thinner now, a layer over something less controlled. You were issued a suspension order. You're not authorized to... She's authorized by me, Rourke said. For the duration of this medical situation, she's operating under federal jurisdiction. That supersedes your administrative action. Marsh opened his mouth. Mr. Marsh. Rourke stepped forward, just a step, but it was the kind of step that ended the conversation he'd been having and opened a different one. We're going to need a room, and we're going to need your full cooperation. He paused. I'd recommend you call your legal counsel. Tonight, if possible. The color in Marsh's face changed by several degrees. My legal counsel. For what possible... That'll become clear. Rourke nodded toward one of his officers, who moved to position himself between Marsh and the exit without making it look like that was what he was doing. The room, he said again. Marsh got them a room. Conference Room B on the 2nd floor, which Emma had been in twice in 3 years, and which had a long oval table and a whiteboard with someone's half-erased budget projections from a meeting 2 weeks ago still on it. Mount. Grantham arrived 20 minutes later, pulled from the surgical prep for Solus by one of Rourke's people with the same quiet, unambiguous authority that seemed to work on everyone. He came in looking combative, and then he saw Emma sitting at the table across from Rourke, and the combativeness got complicated. What is she doing here? He said. Sitting, Emma said. Rourke didn't look up from the tablet. Dr. Grantham, please sit down. I have a patient in surgical prep. Dr. Pratt will supervise. Sit down. Grantham sat. He sat the way people sit when they've been told to do something they feel is beneath them, but have run out of ways to refuse it. Across the table, Emma watched him with the careful, neutrally observational expression she'd developed over 3 years of being in rooms where she was supposed to be furniture. I'm going to explain the situation once, Rourke said, and then I'm going to need you both to answer some questions. He set the tablet on the table and turned it so they could see the screen. The patient currently in your OR is David Solis. He is a federal intelligence operative working under the jurisdiction of a joint task force conducting a domestic institutional accountability investigation. He was injured tonight during an operation directly connected to that investigation. He looked at Marsh. An investigation into Riverside Medical Center. The silence in the room was its own kind of statement. The task force, Rourke continued, has been conducting a review of this institution's patient safety documentation for 6 weeks. In that time, we've identified 17 incidents over the past 4 years in which official hospital records appear to have been amended after the fact. In 14 of those incidents, the original clinical notes, filed by nursing or junior medical staff, documented safety concerns that were not reflected in the final attending or administrative records. Grantham's jaw was tight. Records get corrected all the time. That's standard. The corrections in these cases were made within 12 to 72 hours of the original filing. In 11 of the cases, the staff member who filed the original concern was subsequently placed on administrative review or terminated. Rourke paused. That is not standard. Emma was watching Marsh. He had gone very still, the kind of stillness that wasn't calm but was doing an impersonation of calm. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes were moving between Rourke and Grantham in a way that made her think he was trying to calculate something. This is... Marsh stopped, started again. This requires our legal team to be present before we discuss anything further. Absolutely, Rourke said. Call them now. We'll wait. He leaned back slightly. I want to be transparent with you. The task force is not here tonight because of the investigation timeline. We're here because Mr. Solis's injury tonight occurred in the context of gathering evidence related to this hospital, and because the hospital's own suspended clinical staff appears to have just prevented his death. He glanced at Emma. That's a circumstance that moves things forward. Grantham looked at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite parse. It wasn't gratitude. It was too complicated for gratitude and too reluctant. It was something closer to the look of a person who has just realized that the variable they dismissed is the one that mattered. You knew, he said. It came out before he'd finished deciding to say it. In the trauma bay. You already knew what it was. Emma held his gaze. I've seen it before. Where? He said it like he was actually asking. Not rhetorical, not dismissive, just asking. She didn't answer. Not because she was being evasive, but because the answer was classified and old habits were old habits. Rourke's radio went off. He listened, said 2 words she couldn't make out, and stood. Solis is in the OR. They're reporting stable entry. He looked at Emma. He's going to want to see you. When he's out. I'm not sure I'm the person he thinks I am, Emma said. Rourke picked up his tablet. You're exactly the person he thinks you are. That's the problem for some people in this room, and the solution for others. He walked out. One of his officers stepped into the doorway to fill the space he'd vacated, and Marsh reached for his phone with hands that weren't quite steady, and Grantham sat across from Emma in silence that had gone from hostile to something more ambiguous and harder to name. She got coffee from the machine in the second-floor corridor because there was nothing else to do while Solis was in surgery and Marsh was on the phone with lawyers, and Rourke's team was doing things she wasn't being told about. The machine dispensed something that was technically coffee the way a gas station was technically a travel destination. She drank it standing up, looking out the window at the Silver Creek skyline, modest, low, the kind of city that didn't announce itself, and tried to think about Carvar without thinking about Carvar. David Solis had been the debrief officer. She remembered a face across a table in a temporary facility that no longer existed, asking questions in the careful, non-leading way of someone trained to extract accurate information without contaminating it. She hadn't thought about his face in 4 years. She'd worked at that, the not thinking. The 5 people she'd kept alive in that valley, she thought about them sometimes, not obsessively, not in the way that constituted a clinical problem, but occasionally, in the specific way that you think about the moments in your life when the gap between what happened and what almost happened was narrow enough to see through. One of them had been 19. Del Vera, she remembered the name because it was unusual and because he'd told her it was his grandmother's name, and because he'd been talking about his grandmother while she was packing a wound in his lateral abdomen that he'd been pretending was less serious than it was. She'd worked on him for 4 hours. She hadn't slept in the prior 22. She'd done things in that valley with the equipment available to her that she'd never been asked to do in training and had never done since and hoped never to do again. The coffee was bad. She finished it. Dara appeared at the end of the corridor. Emma hadn't seen her come up from the ER. She hadn't been tracking who was moving through the hospital, which was unlike her and suggested she was more off balance than she'd been letting herself notice. Dara walked toward her with the expression of someone carrying news and not sure how it's going to land. "Abby Wren's family is here," Dara said. "The grandmother. She heard about what happened, the military thing, the ambulance, and she came in. She's asking for you." Emma closed her eyes briefly. "She doesn't need to She knows you were suspended. She talked to someone on the ER staff." Dara hesitated. "She said she wanted to thank the nurse who she thinks saved her granddaughter's life." "I didn't save her. I raised a concern that got ignored until it was almost too late. That's not the same thing." "Tell her that yourself." Dara said it with the particular directness that was her most reliable quality. "Because she's on the first floor and she's 73 years old, and she came out in February at midnight to find you, so maybe just go down and let her say what she came to say." Emma looked at her for a moment. Then she put the empty coffee cup in the recycling bin and went downstairs. The grandmother's name was Bernice Wren. She was small and angular and wearing a coat that was slightly too large, and she stood up when Emma came into the family waiting area with a directness that made her seem larger than she was. She took Emma's hands in both of hers and held them. She didn't say anything for a moment. Emma, who had been prepared for almost everything, was not quite prepared for the silence. "They told me you were suspended," Bernice said finally, "for speaking up for Abby." "I filed a clinical disagreement. That's a normal—" "For speaking up for Abby," Bernice said again, in a tone that didn't leave room for clinical language. Emma looked at her hands, held in this old woman's, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a word for. Not relief exactly, and not grief, but something in that general territory. A loosening of something that had been held tight for a long time. "She's going to be okay," Emma said. "Because of you. Because of the ICU team. Because of the ceftriaxone." She paused. "Because someone read my note." Bernice squeezed her hands once and then let go. She sat back down with the careful movements of someone whose joints didn't always cooperate, and Emma sat across from her in the yellow institutional light of the family waiting area, and they talked for a few minutes. Not about medicine, not about hospitals, but about Abby. What she liked. How she'd been before she got sick. What she'd asked for when she woke up in the ICU. "She asked for her stuffed rabbit," Bernice said. "It's been to 11 countries. That's a well-traveled rabbit. My daughter sends it whenever Abby travels somewhere new." She looked at her hands. "My daughter lives in Brisbane. She's coming in 2 days. She doesn't—" She stopped. She would have been coming for a different reason if things had gone differently. Emma didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't insufficient. "I want to ask you something," Bernice said. "Okay." "Why did they suspend you? Truly, not the paperwork reason." Emma considered the question. "Because I made people uncomfortable. I raised a concern that was inconvenient, and I documented it in a way that made it harder to ignore, and that made me a problem to be managed rather than a staff member to be listened to." Bernice nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Does that happen a lot? Here?" "More than it should." She paused. "Something's changing tonight. I don't know what shape it takes yet, but something is changing." From upstairs, distantly, through the floor, she could hear the controlled activity of Rourke's team, the specific frequency of institutional disruption beginning to make itself felt through the structure of a building that had been, until tonight, very confident in its own authority. Bernice looked at her steadily. "Are you going to be all right?" Emma thought about Carvar, about the debrief officer she hadn't thought of in 4 years, who had asked for her by name as he bled out in the back of an ambulance, about the note she'd written in clinical language that was still in the system because someone had moved it somewhere it couldn't be erased, about Grantham's face in the conference room when he'd asked where, and actually wanted to know. "I think so," she said. And then, because she was tired of being small and contained and not quite honest about things, "I hope so." She was standing up to go back upstairs. Rourke would need her, or Solace would be out of surgery, or something would require her presence somewhere, when Dara appeared in the doorway again. Dara's face had changed. Emma had known Dara for 3 years, and she knew that face, the specific expression that meant something had happened that reorganized the situation. "You need to come upstairs," Dara said. "Now." "What happened?" Dara glanced at Bernice and then back at Emma. "They found something in the records." A pause. "Marsh is asking for his lawyer, and Grantham stopped talking, and there are 2 more vehicles in the parking lot that weren't there an hour ago." She let that settle. "And Rourke is asking for you specifically, not asking, the other kind." Emma looked at Bernice once more. "I have to go." "Go," Bernice said. "Do what you do." Emma turned and followed Dara toward the elevator, and they were halfway down the corridor when her pager, the hospital pager she still technically had because no one had collected it in the suspension process, went off with a code she recognized. Not a patient code, an administrative emergency. She looked at the display. The code was Marsh's office extension. She looked at Dara. Dara looked back. They ran. The pager code was Marsh's office extension, but the voice that answered when Rourke's officer called it back was not Marsh. It was a federal agent named Vargas, compact, 30s, the kind of face that gave nothing away as a professional habit. And she was standing in Marsh's office on the 3rd floor when Emma and Dara came through the door. And she was standing there because Marsh had been found attempting to access the hospital's records management server from his personal workstation at 11:47 p.m., which was 40 minutes after Rourke had told him to call his lawyer and sit still. He had not sat still. He was sitting now, in the chair in front of his own desk, rather than behind it, which was a small but precise repositioning of authority. And he was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has just made a very serious miscalculation and is still in the first stage of understanding how serious. His lawyer, reached by phone, still 40 minutes away, had told him to say nothing. He was saying nothing. But his hands, flat on his thighs, were doing the work his face was trying not to do. "What did he access?" Emma asked Vargas quietly, standing near the door. "He didn't get in. The server logged the attempt and flagged it to our monitoring system automatically." Vargas glanced at her. "We had a passive tap on the administrative network as of 3 weeks ago. Everything he touches is logged." She paused. "What's interesting is what he was trying to reach. Not his own files. Not general records." She held Emma's gaze for a moment. "The nursing documentation archive, specifically the incident note subfolder." Emma went still. The incident note subfolder was where clinical disagreements were filed, where concerns got documented by nursing staff in the language that was supposed to protect patients and instead protected the institution from the patient's complaints, where her note about Abby Wren had been archived, moved, preserved, by someone who apparently understood its value. "He was trying to delete them," Emma said, "or someone specific was trying to confirm they were still there." Vargas let that sit. Either way, the attempt is now evidence of consciousness of guilt, which is a useful thing for us to have. She looked at Marsh with the flat professional assessment of someone cataloging an asset. "Mr. Marsh has been advised of his rights. He's waiting for counsel." Dara had stopped in the doorway and was watching all of this with her arms crossed and her expression carefully arranged. She caught Emma's eye and they shared a look that didn't need words. 3 years of working alongside each other had built a shorthand that covered situations nobody had thought to script. Rourke appeared from the inner office, where a second workstation had been set up. He had the tablet again, and he looked like someone who hadn't slept in some time and had made a professional arrangement with that fact. "Solis is out of surgery," he said to Emma. "Stable. The surgical team says he'll be intubated until morning. When he comes off the vent," he checked his watch, "probably 6-7 a.m., he'll want to talk." "About what?" "About what he found, what he was carrying when he was hit." Rourke moved past Marsh's desk without looking at him, a deliberate non-acknowledgement that was its own kind of pressure, and stopped near the window. Outside, Silver Creek was doing what mid-sized cities did at midnight, which was mostly nothing. A few lit windows and the amber wash of streetlights and the distant signal of a freight train crossing somewhere east of downtown. "He had a drive on him, encrypted. Our tech team is working it now." "What's on it?" "We believe it's a complete copy of the altered records. The originals and the amended versions time-stamped, with metadata intact. He looked at her. If that's what it is, it's the primary evidence for the case. It's also the reason he was attacked tonight. He paused. Someone knew he had it. Someone in a position to know what he was doing and when. Emma looked at Marsh. Marsh was still staring at the middle distance. His hands had gone from flat to slightly clenched. Someone inside the hospital, she said. That's the working assumption. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of Vargas typing something on the workstation and the distant hum of the building's HVAC system and whatever was happening in Marsh's head, which was not quiet at all, she suspected. I need to walk, Emma said. Not dramatically. She just needed to move. Her body had been in controlled response mode for 3 hours, and it needed to do something that wasn't stand in a room and absorb information. Rourke nodded. Stay in the building. We may need you fast. She went. The hospital at midnight had a different quality than the hospital at 7 p.m. The volume was lower, but the tension was different. Less of the ambient stress of a full-staffed, fully operational ER, and more of the specific, brittle quiet of a place that knew something was wrong but didn't yet know the shape of it. Emma walked the corridor on the 3rd floor and then took the stairs to the 4th, where the administrative offices were dark and empty, and then down to the 2nd, where the surgical wing's waiting area had 2 people in it, a middle-aged man asleep in a chair and a younger woman who was not asleep, who was staring at a vending machine with the unseen intensity of someone who had been waiting for a long time. She didn't stop. She kept moving. She was on the stairs between the 2nd and 1st floors when Miguel Castillo found her. He was coming up while she was going down, and they almost collided on the landing, and he grabbed the railing and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been trying to locate her for a while. There you are, he said. Okay. There are things happening that nobody is explaining to the ER staff, and Terrence is managing it, but barely, and there are 2 federal agents at the nursing station, and someone told me you were suspended, but you're clearly not suspended. And he stopped, regrouped. Are you okay? Emma looked at him. Miguel Castillo was 34 years old and had been an Army medic before he'd become an ER tech, which was something she'd known from his 2nd week on the job and had never mentioned because it wasn't relevant to anything that needed mentioning. He had the competence and the particular situational awareness of someone whose training had been in environments where situational awareness was the difference between going home and not going home. The patient who came in tonight, she said, the tactical one. Yeah. He's stable. He's in surgical recovery. She looked at him steadily. There are things happening that I can't fully explain yet, but the short version is that this hospital has a problem, and tonight is when the problem becomes visible to people who can do something about it. Miguel processed this with the economy of expression she'd always respected in him. The records thing. She felt something cold move through her. What do you know about the records thing? I don't know anything specific. I know that twice in the past year I filed incident reports, and they came back to me with corrections I didn't make. He said it simply, without drama. I refiled both times. The 2nd time I was told the original had been superseded. I kept copies. He looked at her. I kept them at home. She stared at him. You have copies. Physical, printed, because I didn't trust the system and I didn't know who to give them to, so I just kept them. He shrugged with one shoulder. I'm a paranoid person. It's a documented personality trait. Emma thought about Rourke's team in Marsh's office and the encrypted drive and the 17 incidents and the time-stamped metadata and the careful, methodical architecture of an investigation that had been building for 6 weeks. Miguel, she said, you need to come upstairs with me. I must have. Rourke looked at the printed incident reports. The way you look at something you expected to find and are still surprised to find, a relief tempered by the weight of what it confirmed. He had Miguel sit down and asked him questions in the same careful, non-leading way that Solis apparently used in debriefs, and Miguel answered them with the precision of someone who had been carrying this information in a state of suspended uncertainty for months and was relieved to finally give it to someone who knew what to do with it. The 2 incidents Miguel had documented were not on Rourke's original list of 17. They were 18 and 19. Vargas photographed the documents and logged them into evidence, and Miguel signed a statement and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has just set down something heavy. "They're going to fire me," he said. "You're protected under federal whistleblower statute as of tonight," Rourke said. "When you go back downstairs, document anything anyone says to you about tonight's events." He paused. "And if anyone tries to access your personnel file, I'd like to know about it within the hour." Miguel looked at Emma. "Is this what working with you is actually like?" "I've never worked with you," she said. "We've worked adjacent to each other. Tonight feels collaborative. Despite everything, the hour, the exhaustion that was beginning to accumulate at the edges of her awareness, the specific weight of a night that had compressed 6 weeks of institutional reckoning into 8 hours. She almost smiled. "Go back downstairs, document everything." He went. At the door, he turned back briefly. "For what it's worth," he said, "I filed those concerns because you did. I saw you file the Wren documentation, and I thought, if she's doing it, it matters. So I did it." He looked at her for a moment. "Just so you know where that came from." He left before she could respond to that, which was probably for the best because she didn't have a response that would have been adequate. At 2:15 in this morning, Grantham asked to speak to Emma alone. Rourke permitted it, monitored technically, because everything in the building was monitored now, but alone in the sense of no additional personnel in the room. They used a small consultation space off the second-floor corridor, and Grantham came in without his usual posture, which was the most unsettling thing about him. He was still in his attending's coat, but it was rumpled and he'd undone the top button of his collar, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a person rather than a performance of a department chief. He sat down. She sat across from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I need you to understand," he started, "that I didn't know the records were being changed." Emma watched him. "Okay." "I knew the administrative review process was... I knew concerns weren't always followed up the way they should be. I knew staff got managed out when they created friction. I thought that was..." He stopped. "I thought that was just how institutions work. I didn't think about it beyond that." "That's a choice," she said. "Not thinking beyond that is a choice." He didn't argue. That was interesting. "The Wren case," he said. "Keyes called Marsh directly. I found that out tonight. Rourke showed me the phone records. Keyes called Marsh before he came and suspended you, and Marsh told him to manage the situation." He looked at his hands. "I didn't know that. If you'd listened to me about Abby Wren, Keyes wouldn't have needed to call anyone." The words landed. She watched them land. Grantham had the grace, or the exhaustion, not to deflect them. "You were right," he said. "It came out stripped of everything. No qualification, no context, no physician's hedge. Just 3 words in the order that made them hardest to say. About the Wren patient, about Metcalf. Probably about things I don't know about." He looked up. "The thing in the trauma bay tonight. What you did. I've done a decompression maybe a dozen times. I would have ordered imaging first. I would have lost him." Emma didn't say anything. "I want to know," Grantham said, "what I'm actually looking at tonight. Not the federal investigation. I understand that. I mean you." He held her gaze. "You knew what that injury pattern was before you touched him. You knew it the way I know it, not from a textbook. I've been in emergency medicine for 19 years, and I know the difference." She considered how much to say. Then she considered that she was sitting in a hospital that had spent 3 years deciding she wasn't worth listening to, and she was tired of the calculations about what to volunteer and what to contain. "Combat medic," she said. "Army, attached to special operations for the last 2 years of my service." Grantham absorbed this. "That's not on your CV." "No, it's classified." She paused. "The work I did is classified. The record that exists is generic. A lot of what I know, procedurally, clinically, came from situations that don't have official documentation. And tonight's patient, you knew him." "I knew of him. He knew of me." Grantham sat with that. He looked like a man reorganizing a large amount of information that had been stored under incorrect labels. "When you raised the concern about Metcalf," he said slowly, "and I told you to stay in your lane, you don't need to reconstruct it." "I want to." His voice was flat, not defensive. "I said it like it was a factual statement, Like your lane was a fixed thing I had accurate information about. He looked at her steadily. I didn't have accurate information about anything relevant to you. Emma looked at the wall. It was a beige wall with a framed patient rights poster that nobody had updated in several years, and it was the least interesting wall she had ever looked at, and she looked at it because she needed a moment where nobody was watching her face. The system, she said finally, trained you to use that phrase and trained me to absorb it. Neither of us invented it. It predated us both. She looked back at him. That doesn't make it not harmful, but it means the accountability is bigger than just you. Grantham nodded once, slowly. I'm going to be asked to provide testimony about administrative practices, about the review process for clinical concerns. He paused. I'm going to tell them what I know, which isn't as much as it should be, but it's honest. That's a start, she said. She meant it. It wasn't forgiveness. She hadn't decided about forgiveness, and she wasn't sure it was hers to give anyway. But it was an acknowledgement that something was trying to shift, even if the shifting was imperfect and 3 years late. Though, at 4 a.m., the drive that Solis had been carrying decrypted. Rourke summoned Emma back to the third floor, not because she needed to see it firsthand, but because, he said, she was going to be asked about the contents in a formal proceeding, and he wanted her to have context. Vargas walked her through it on a secondary screen, while 2 federal tech agents worked the primary. The drive contained what Rourke had believed it would contain. It contained it in full. 231 patient incident records spanning 4 years, in 2 versions each. The original version, the clinical documentation as initially filed, and the amended version, as it existed in the hospital's official records system. The metadata on each pair showed the timestamp of the original filing and the timestamp of the amendment, along with a user ID that corresponded, in every case Vargas had checked so far, to one of 3 administrative accounts. One of those accounts belonged to Marsh. One belonged to Keyes. The third belonged to Dr. Sylvia Pratt, chief of surgery, who was currently at home and had no idea that her name was appearing on a federal evidence drive at 4 in the morning. Emma stood in front of the screen and read the records one by one. Not all 231. There wasn't time, and she didn't have the clearance for some of the associated materials, but the ones Vargas flagged for her. 7 nursing clinical concerns, amended to remove the original language and replace it with attending physician-approved documentation that recharacterized the presentation, the assessment, the recommended course of action. In 5 of the 7 cases, the patient subsequently experienced an adverse event. In 2 of those 5, the adverse event was severe. She read the names. She didn't know most of them. They were people who had come to this hospital and trusted it and encountered a system that was running 2 parallel processes, one visible, one not. And the invisible one was cleaning up after the visible one to protect something that had nothing to do with patient welfare. The financial picture, Vargas said, is still being assembled, but the working theory is that the record amendments were being used to suppress liability exposure. Documented clinical concerns create a paper trail that plaintiffs' attorneys can use in malpractice actions. If the concern doesn't appear in the official record, if it's been replaced with documentation showing the attending's judgment was unchallenged, the liability position of the institution changes significantly. Emma looked at the screen. They were doing this to avoid lawsuits. To suppress evidence that would support lawsuits? Yes. And in some cases, to avoid regulatory review, the State Health Commission reviews incident reports as part of their oversight function. If the report doesn't reflect a safety concern, it doesn't trigger a review. And Solis found all of this. Solis had access to the altered records through a separate investigation that's above my pay grade to explain fully. He was in the process of copying and transmitting the original versions, which he'd obtained through a source inside the hospital, when he was intercepted. Vargas looked at her. The source is someone who had been quietly preserving originals for 2 years. We don't have a confirmed identity yet, but the access pattern suggests... She stopped. It suggests nursing staff, senior, with long institutional history. Emma thought of Dara, of the way Dara had taken the Wren chart from her hands, of Dara's careful, neutral expression when things happened that Dara was watching very closely, of Dara, who had been at Riverside longer than anyone and who had, Emma now suspected, a much more precise understanding of what was wrong here than she had ever let show. She went to find Dara. Dara was in the ER break room, alone, with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. She looked up when Emma came in, and her expression did something complicated that resolved into a kind of resigned calm. "They figured it out," Dara said. Not a question. Emma sat down across from her. "Were you the source?" Dara looked at her tea. "I've been here 14 years, she said. "I watched them change the first record in the second year. I recognized it because I had filed a concern. Not mine, another nurse's. I was charged that day. And when I pulled the chart the next week to follow up, the language was different. Not wrong exactly, just different, softer, missing the specificity." She looked up. "I started keeping copies after that. Not because I had a plan, because I didn't know what else to do." "Dara?" "I know." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I should have gone to someone sooner. I should have gone to the state commission or an attorney or someone. But every time I got close to doing it, I thought about what happens to people in this building who make noise, and I—" She stopped. "I kept the copies, and I waited for something. I didn't know what I was waiting for." 2 years ago, Emma said carefully, "someone approached you." Dara looked at her for a moment, then, "He said he was doing a background review for a federal contract the hospital was bidding on. He asked to see supporting documentation for several incidents. I gave him copies." She paused. "He came back 3 times. I didn't ask questions after the first visit. That was Solis. I didn't know his name. I still don't, officially." Dara looked at her hands. He's stable. He's in surgical recovery." Some of the tension in Dara's shoulders released. "I need to talk to them," she said. "The federal people." "Yes." "Tonight?" "I think so." Emma looked at her steadily. "You're protected, Dara. What you did, the preservation, the cooperation, that's whistleblower activity under federal statute. Rourke's team knows what they're doing. And when Marsh finds out it was me—" Emma thought about Marsh sitting in front of his own desk with his hands clenched on his thighs, waiting for a lawyer who was 40 minutes away. "Marsh is going to have other things to think about." Dara nodded, slowly. Then she looked at Emma with an expression that was direct in a way she hadn't been direct before, stripped of the careful neutrality, the professional management of her own reactions. "They were wrong about you," she said. "All of them. Every time they talked to you like you were nothing." She paused. "I should have said that out loud before tonight." Emma held her gaze. "You preserved the records. That mattered more than anything you could have said. It shouldn't have been the only option." Her voice was quiet but not soft. "It shouldn't have gotten to a point where the only thing I could do was save paper in a filing cabinet at home and hope something happened." She was right. Emma didn't argue with it. "Come upstairs," she said. "Tell them what you know." They went together, and the corridor was quiet around them, and the hospital's nighttime sounds were the same as they always were, and yet the building felt different, like a structure that had been weight-bearing something it wasn't designed for, and had just had that weight redistributed in a way that was going to change the shape of everything. At the stairwell, Emma's pager went off again. She looked at the display. Surgical recovery. Bay 7. One word typed by whoever was managing the post-op monitoring system, logged at 4:22 a.m. The word was awake. She stopped walking. Solis was off the vent. He was awake 5 hours before anyone had projected he would be, which meant either the surgical team had found less damage than they'd anticipated, or Solis was the kind of person who forced his own body back to consciousness when he had decided the situation required it. She turned to Dara. "Go upstairs. Ask for Rourke. Tell him Solis is awake." "What are you going to do?" Emma was already moving toward the stairs. "What I came back here to do." She took the stairs 2 at a time, which was not particularly dignified and which she didn't care about, and she was most of the way to the surgical recovery bay when she rounded the corner and stopped. Outside Bay 7, one of Rourke's officers was positioned at the door, standard security, expected. But beside him, in conversation she couldn't yet hear, stood Dr. Sylvia Pratt, in her coat, at 4:30 in the morning, speaking quietly and with the controlled urgency of someone who had been called in and had come in and was now trying to do something she considered necessary before anyone could stop her. Emma moved closer. Pratt was saying, "My patient, I have a clinical right to assess." Ma'am, the officer said patiently, the patient has not authorized. I don't need the patient's authorization to perform a medical assessment in my own surgical recovery ward. Step aside. Dr. Pratt? Emma's voice was level. Pratt turned. Her face went through several expressions very quickly: surprise, irritation, something harder underneath both. Why are you here? That's not your concern, Pratt said. Her composure was good, but she'd come in at 4:30 in the morning and she hadn't called ahead to the nursing staff, and Emma knew because she'd just come from the third floor where Vargas had said Pratt's user ID was on the drive. And the math of this moment was not complicated. It's very much my concern, Emma said quietly. She stepped to the side so that she was between Pratt and the bay door. You should go back to the third floor. Rourke will want to talk to you. Pratt looked at her. In her eyes was the specific calculation of a person figuring out exactly how much Emma knew and whether there was still a move available on the board. The calculation ran for 3 seconds, Emma counted, and then something in Pratt's expression changed. Not defeat, not quite. Something more like the moment when you stop pretending you're going to win and start deciding what you're going to do instead. You have no idea, Pratt said softly, how deep this goes. Emma met her eyes. Tell me. And Pratt's mouth opened, and then from inside Bay 7, clearly audible through the door, came a voice that was hoarse from intubation and slow from anesthesia, but was unmistakably conscious and alert and present. Hayes. The voice paused, recalibrated, pushed through the rasp. I need Hayes, now! Pratt's expression collapsed. The officer stepped aside without being asked a second time. Emma pushed through the door. Surgical Recovery Bay 7 was dim, the standard low lighting of a post-op space designed to ease the transition back to consciousness. And it smelled the way all recovery bays smelled, antiseptic layered over something organic and metabolic that no cleaning protocol ever fully addressed. There were 2 nurses in the bay who looked up when Emma entered with the particular alertness of people who had been told to expect something unusual and were now watching it arrive. David Solis was in the bed nearest the window. He had a nasal cannula running oxygen at 4 liters, an IV in each arm, a cardiac monitor tracing something steady and slightly fast in the low 80s, and the specific pallor of someone who had recently had a significant amount of blood replaced. He'd been extubated. The intubation tape residue was still visible at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were open, and they were tracking. He looked worse than she'd expected. The surgery had taken 3 hours and change, which meant they'd found more than the initial imaging had suggested, which meant Solis had spent those hours on a table having damage corrected that had been compounding since the rig. He was alive. He was conscious. Those were the relevant facts. Everything else was a medical problem to be managed in the next 72 hours. He looked at her. Sergeant Hayes, he said. His voice was ruined from the tube, raw and flat, but the precision in it was intact. I'm not a sergeant anymore, she said. She moved to the side of the bed and looked at his monitor without making it obvious she was looking at it. Cardiac trace was acceptable. Respiratory rate slightly elevated. You're supposed to be unconscious until 6 a.m. I'm aware. He didn't sound apologetic. I need to tell you something before Rourke gets in here and it becomes official. She pulled the chair from beside the wall and sat. Whatever he needed to say, she was going to let him say it without making him fight his own body harder than necessary. I'm listening. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering something, she thought, or managing pain that he wasn't going to mention, and then opened them again. Pratt, he said. Sylvia Pratt. She's not who they think she is in this. Emma went still. What do you mean? The user ID on those records, the one attached to her account. She didn't make those changes. He watched her face. Someone used her credentials. She came to me 6 months ago. She's the one who told me the record system had been compromised. She flagged it internally first. Marsh buried it. Then she went outside. He paused for breath. Careful, controlled. She's not a perpetrator. She's a second source. She's been cooperating with my team since November. Emma sat with that for a moment. Outside the bay, in the corridor, she could hear Pratt's voice, still talking to the officer, lower now, less urgent, and the sound of footsteps coming from the direction of the stairs, which would be Rourke. Someone used her credentials to implicate her, Emma said. Yes. Another careful breath. Marsh or Keyes, we think Keyes, based on the access patterns, pulled her login from the shared administrative system and used it for the later amendments, either to have a scapegoat or to muddy the evidence chain. He met her eyes. If your people arrest her tonight, we lose a critical witness and the defense attorneys for Marsh and Keyes get to build a narrative around a compromised investigation. She stood. I need to stop Rourke. That's why I'm awake. She was already moving toward the door. She caught Rourke in the corridor 8 feet from the bay entrance. He had 2 agents with him and was moving with the focused velocity of someone with a task he'd already decided on. She stepped directly into his path, and he pulled up short with the reflexes of someone who did not typically need to pull up short. Pratt is a cooperating witness, Emma said. Solis just told me. Someone used her credentials for the later record amendments. She approached Solis 6 months ago. Rourke looked at her. 1 second. 2. He was running a calculation. She could see it, the rapid cross-referencing of what he knew against what she'd just told him, and then he turned to the agent on his left and said, Hold. The agent stopped. Rourke looked back at Emma. He's awake. Yes. He's not supposed to be awake. He was apparently operating on his own timeline. She held his gaze. He said Keyes used her login for the later amendments. He says she's been cooperating since November. Rourke pulled out his tablet. He was scrolling through something, access logs, she assumed, or the metadata from the drive, and his expression was doing the work of someone who has just had a structural piece of their model shift and is rapidly rebuilding around it. The later amendments, he said, the last 11, the metadata on those shows a slightly different. He stopped. The terminal ID is different from the earlier ones. We flagged it as possibly a different workstation. He looked up. Keyes has an office on the 3rd floor. Pratt's office is on the 2nd. Keyes accessed the system from Pratt's office, or from a remote session using her credentials, which is, he was already turning away from the bay door. I need to verify this before we do anything with Pratt. To the agents, nobody moves on the surgeon until I've talked to Solis directly. Nobody. He looked at Emma. 5 minutes. Can you keep her in the building for 5 minutes without it looking like she's being held? Emma turned and went back to the corridor intersection where Pratt was still standing, coat slightly wrong, hands at her sides. The officer had not let her through. She looked, Emma thought, like someone who had spent the last 10 minutes understanding the full dimensions of the corner she was in. Dr. Pratt, Emma said, Solis is asking for you. Pratt looked at her. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, but a complex relief that had fear underneath it. He told you. He told me enough. She paused. Come inside. Pratt came. She walked into the bay and stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at Solis, and the look that passed between them was not the look of strangers. It was the careful, weighted acknowledgement of 2 people who had been running a risk together for months and had just arrived at the moment when that risk resolved one way or the other. I tried to get here before they moved on me, Pratt said. Her voice was stripped down. I heard the federal vehicles were in the building, and I thought, You thought they were coming for you, Solis said. With my credentials on the file, yes. You should have called the secure line. The secure line goes to your phone. Your phone was... She stopped. I didn't know if you were alive. A beat of silence. Solis looked at the ceiling for a moment. I'm alive, he said. Somewhat. Pratt's composure, which had been structural rather than genuine for the last hour, fractured slightly at that. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathed, and then straightened. What do I need to do? Talk to Rourke, Solis said. Tell him everything from the beginning. Don't try to manage it. He paused. He's good at this. Let him do his job. By 5 a.m., Rourke had restructured the investigation's immediate posture around the new information. Pratt sat down with Vargas and a federal attorney who had arrived by car sometime in the last 40 minutes and began a formal proffer, the legal process by which a cooperating witness lays out what they know in exchange for use immunity. Emma was not in the room for that. She was not supposed to be. But she was in the corridor, and the corridor was not soundproofed. and she understood enough of what she heard to know that Pratt's account was extensive and specific and was going to cause several people significant problems in the very near future. The focus of those problems was Roland Keyes. Keyes had not been in the building when the federal vehicles arrived. He'd been at home, his home being a 4-bedroom colonial 12 minutes from the hospital, which Rourke's team had established within the first hour as part of standard subject location protocol. He was there now, which meant he did not know what was in the drive, did not know what Pratt was saying, and did not know that the calculation he had been running for 4 years had just been shown to be built on incorrect assumptions about what would and wouldn't come to light. At 5:17, 2 federal agents went to Roland Keyes' home. Emma wasn't there for that either. She heard about it from Rourke at 5:45, relayed in the flat, precise language of someone reporting operational facts. "He opened the door in his robe," Rourke said. "He asked if something had happened at the hospital." He looked at his tablet. When the agents told him he was being detained for questioning in connection with a federal investigation, he said, Rourke paused. He seemed to be reading something he found either notable or tiresome. He said, "This is about the nurse, isn't it?" Emma looked at him. "Direct quote," Rourke said. His first response, when informed he was being detained in a federal investigation, was to ask if it was about a nurse. She thought about what that meant, not symbolically, but practically. That her name, or her role, or the specific threat she represented to the system they'd built, was the thing Keyes reached for first in a moment of fear. That she had been, for the duration of her time at Riverside, more dangerous to the architecture of their concealment than anyone had told her, or than she'd known, or than they'd let show. 3 years of staying small, 3 years of calibrating her footprint. And the first thing Keyes thought of when the door opened on the worst morning of his professional life was the nurse. She didn't say anything about this to Rourke. She filed it. Marcia's attorney arrived at 6:03, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s named Holloway, who had clearly been pulled from sleep and was managing this with the grim competence of someone very expensive. She spent 40 minutes with Marcia in the conference room and then came out and asked to speak with the lead federal agent, and what she said to Vargas, in the corridor not quite quietly enough, was that her client wished to discuss the possibility of a cooperation agreement. Emma heard this from the nursing station where she had been sitting with Terrence, who had been running the overnight ER with the stoic endurance of someone who had decided that whatever was happening on the upper floors was above his authority level and had simply kept his department functional through it. He was drinking his third coffee of the shift, and she was drinking water, and they were not talking much, which was a comfortable arrangement. "Marsh wants to cooperate," Terrence said. He'd heard it too. "He wants to reduce his exposure," Emma said. "Those aren't the same thing, but one of them leads to the other." "What does that mean for—" He gestured upward vaguely, encompassing all of it. "It means the case gets faster and messier and more public." She turned her water cup in her hands. "It means Keyes and probably others don't get the protection of a unified front. When one person talks, it changes the math for everyone else." Terrence nodded. He looked at his coffee. "Abby Wren is being moved out of the ICU this morning. I got the update 20 minutes ago. Pediatric ward. She's asking for Jell-O." Emma looked at him. "Thought you'd want to know," he said simply. She did want to know. She wanted to know it more than almost anything else that had happened in the last 8 hours, which surprised her slightly, and then didn't. At 7:15, Rourke convened what he called a situational summary in the second-floor conference room, which was a phrase that covered the fact that he was briefing a growing number of federal personnel on a case that had expanded significantly overnight. Emma was present. So was Dara, who had given her formal statement at 3 a.m. and had stayed. So was Miguel, who had also stayed, and Grantham, who had been asked to remain available. Pratt was there, sitting apart from the others with the careful posture of someone navigating a distinction, no longer suspect, not quite cleared, in the functional limbo of a cooperating witness whose value was still being assessed. Rourke laid it out. Not for Emma's benefit, she knew most of it, but for the assembled personnel and the 2 federal attorneys who were positioning the legal architecture around the evidence. 231 amended records, 19 incidents documented by staff who were subsequently disciplined or terminated, Miguel's 2 now confirmed and added to the formal count. A pattern of credential misuse traced specifically to Keyes's remote sessions. A financial analysis, still in progress, suggesting that the record amendments had contributed to the suppression of at least 4 potential liability claims worth a combined estimated $8.3 million. An operational intelligence asset, Solus, compromised during an evidence-gathering phase, with the attack on him traced to a communication breach that the task force was still working to locate. And at the center of all of it, a nursing staff that had filed accurate, careful, clinically sound concerns for years and had been systematically managed out, ignored, or documented over. The incident note archive, Rourke said, represents the most significant evidentiary element in this case, alongside the drive. The original documentation, preserved by a staff member who had no formal authority to do so, and did it anyway over a period of 2 years, is the chain of evidence that allows us to demonstrate what the amended records were amended from. He looked briefly at Dara. That preservation is going to matter. In court, it will matter a great deal. Dara received this without expression, which was its own kind of expression. Grantham, who had been sitting at the far end of the table with the face of someone doing sustained accounting, said, "What happens to clinical staff who didn't participate in the amendments, but didn't report concerns to external authorities?" He wasn't looking at anyone specifically. He was asking the room. "That depends," one of the federal attorneys said, "on what specific actions were or weren't taken, and in what time frame." "I knew the review process was inadequate," Grantham said. "I didn't know records were being changed. I want that distinction documented. It will be. And I'm willing to provide full testimony about the administrative culture and the specific incidents I'm aware of." He paused. "Including the incidents I handled incorrectly." Nobody said anything to that. Emma looked at the table. It wasn't redemption. It was something smaller and more useful. A man recognizing the boundary of what he'd done and deciding to be accurate about it. That was worth something. It wasn't enough, but it was worth something. Mom. At 8 a.m., Keyes was brought to the federal field office in downtown Silver Creek for formal questioning. He had declined to answer substantive questions at his home, which was his right, and had asked for counsel, which was also his right. But the agents who transported him reported that during the drive in the presence of counsel, he had said one thing unprompted. He had said, "I want to know what Pratt told them." Rourke relayed this to Emma at the nursing station, where she had returned because she needed something to do with her hands and had ended up restocking supply trays, which was a task she could do with her eyes closed and which required no decision-making. "He thinks she's the weak point," Emma said. "He built the credential laundering around her. He thought, if it ever unraveled, she'd take the weight of it." Rourke watched her stock the trays. He didn't know she'd already been talking to Solus for 6 months. Emma set a box of gauze pads in its slot. He underestimated her. Yes. He had a lot of company in that. Rourke looked at her for a moment. "You know the formal investigation is going to take months. The criminal prosecution, longer. This doesn't resolve tonight." "I know. What happens to you in the meantime is, it's not entirely within my authority to determine. Your suspension is an administrative action by a hospital administration that is, as of this morning, significantly compromised. Legally, I'm not worried about it tonight," she said. She was. She knew she was. But she was too tired to process it usefully, and there were other things that mattered more right now than the status of her nursing license and her employment, and the particular institutional wreckage of her career at a hospital that had spent 3 years deciding she was furniture. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, what you did last night, in the trauma bay, without authorization, without support, in a situation where most people would have walked back out the door." He paused. "That's going to be documented accurately." She looked at him. He wasn't a man who said things for effect. She'd established that in the first 10 minutes. He said things because they were true and needed saying. "Thank you," she said. She went back to restocking the trays. The ER around her was coming into the morning shift change, new faces arriving, overnight staff handing off, the institutional rhythm reasserting itself over the disruption of the night. Terrence gave his report to the incoming charge nurse in the clipped, comprehensive language of a man who had seen a great deal and was not going to editorialize about it in a professional handoff. The federal personnel on the upper floors were less visible than they'd been at 3 a.m. They were still there, working, but they'd integrated into the building's operations in a way that was less disruptive and more thorough. The hospital was the same building it had been 12 hours ago. The same pale corridors, the same monitors, the same ambient sounds of a clinical institution doing its work. But the infrastructure underneath it, the invisible architecture of who had authority and how it was used and what got recorded and what got changed, that was a different matter. That was cracked in ways that were not going to be plastered over. She finished the trays and was moving toward the corridor when her pager went off for the third time in 12 hours. She looked at the display. Surgical recovery. Bay 7. Not a code. A message, which was unusual. Pagers didn't usually carry messages, but someone had typed one in, 11 characters. Needs to talk. She was turning toward the stairs when Vargas appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast with an expression that reorganized the morning. "We have a problem," Vargas said. "What kind?" "The drive." Vargas was close now, voice low. "Our tech team finished the full analysis 20 minutes ago. The 231 records, we have all of them." She stopped. "But there's a subdirectory we didn't open last night because it was encrypted separately. Solis had a second passphrase for it." She held Emma's gaze. "He gave it to us this morning. From recovery." Emma waited. "The subdirectory contains correspondence," Vargas said, "between Marsh and an external party, spanning 3 years." She paused. "The external party is not a law firm. It's not a financial institution. It's a state regulatory official, a senior one, in the Health Commission's Oversight Division." Emma's mind moved through the implications quickly. The Health Commission reviewed incident reports. The Health Commission was the external oversight body that the record amendments had been, in part, designed to deceive. If someone inside the commission had been receiving communications from Marsh, had been coordinating with him, had been managing what the commission reviewed and what it didn't, the oversight body was compromised, Emma said. "That's what the correspondence suggests, yes." Vargas looked like someone who had started this investigation expecting one thing and was arriving by stages at something significantly larger. This isn't just a hospital administration protecting itself from liability claims. Someone was managing the external oversight mechanism for years. She paused. Which means every official review of this hospital's patient safety record, every clean bill of health from the commission, every past inspection, was managed, Emma said. Yes. The corridor was quiet around them. Morning light was beginning to come through the windows at the east end, gray February light, thin and without warmth, the kind that illuminated without flattering. Emma thought about 231 patients, about the adverse events that hadn't needed to happen, about the staff who had filed accurate concerns and been managed out and had believed, as she had believed, that there was no external authority worth approaching because the institutional walls were solid. The walls had not been solid. They'd been held up from the outside. "Who is it?" she asked. "The regulatory official." Vargas said the name. Emma didn't recognize it. She had no reason to know the names of Health Commission officials. But she saw, in Vargas's expression, that the name was recognizable to people who knew the commission's structure, and that its appearance in a subdirectory on a federal evidence drive was the kind of thing that changed the scope of a case from local to something considerably larger. Her pager went off again. The same bay. A different message this time. 4 words. "It's not over yet." She went to Bay 7 first. That was a decision she made before she'd fully processed Vargas's information, before the weight of state regulatory official and external oversight compromised had settled into something she could think around. She went because the pager had said, "It's not over yet," and because Solis was awake, and because he had been 4 steps ahead of everyone in this building since before she'd known he existed. And if he was sending forward messages from a surgical recovery bed 8 hours post-op, he had a reason. He was sitting up slightly, someone had adjusted the head of the bed, and he looked worse in the morning light than he had at 4 a.m., which was the honest truth about recovery that nobody put in the brochure. The body's accounting came due in stages. His color was poor, and there were new tension lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but his focus was intact, which was the thing that mattered. You saw the subdirectory, he said. Vargas told me. Emma sat in the chair. You knew about the commission contact. I've known for 4 months. It's why the timeline moved when it did. It's why I was in Silver Creek. He shifted carefully, testing something, adjusting, and his jaw tightened for a moment before he controlled it. The commission official is a man named Gerald Farrow, Deputy Director of Institutional Oversight. He and Marsh have been in contact since the 3rd year of Marsh's tenure here. Farrow was the reviewing officer for every major safety inspection of this hospital during that period. Every clean review, Emma said. Every past inspection. Coordinated. Not in writing, mostly, but there are 11 emails on that drive that are enough to establish the relationship, enough to show that Marsh was informing Farrow in advance of inspection parameters, enough to show that adverse findings were being softened before they became official. He looked at her steadily. Farrow had oversight responsibility for 6 hospitals in this district. We don't know yet how many of them had similar arrangements. The implications of that sat in the room between them. 6 hospitals. Patient safety oversight. Years. This is bigger than Riverside, Emma said. Yes, it has been for a while. Riverside was the entry point, the institution with the clearest documented evidence, partly because of what Daro Okonkwo preserved, and partly because of what you filed. He paused. Your incident documentation was the thread, the one that, when pulled, was attached to something that went further than anyone expected. Emma looked at her hands. She was still wearing the nursing uniform with the coffee stain on the left cuff. She'd been in it for, she calculated, almost 18 hours. It seemed like information from a previous version of the night. Farrow is going to be arrested this morning, Solis said. There's a federal team at his home now coordinating with Rourke. It's simultaneous with the formal detention of Keyes and the processing of Marsh's cooperation agreement. He paused for breath, measured, deliberate. It needs to happen at the same time, so none of them can warn the others. The cooperation agreement Marsh signed this morning has a non-communication clause, but you don't trust it. I trust the legal instrument. I don't trust frightened people to follow legal instruments when their instinct is to reach for a phone. He looked at her. Rourke has it handled. I just need you to know the full picture. Because you're going to be asked questions today, formally, in a recorded interview, and I want you to have context, not surprises. She nodded. The formal interview. Federal investigators, this afternoon, if you're willing. Your account of the clinical incidents, the suspension, the events in the trauma bay, it goes into the evidentiary record. He met her eyes. You're not a subject. You're a witness, a material one. I know the difference, she said. He almost smiled. It was a thin expression, constrained by pain and the general indignity of being in a hospital bed when you were the kind of person who was used to not being in hospital beds. I know you do. He looked at the window. The February light was still gray, still thin. I read the commendation I wrote for Carvar last week. Before this operation, I pulled the file and read it. He paused. It doesn't do the situation justice. Most classified commendations don't. The operational security requirements strip the language of anything that communicates what actually happened. He looked back at her. What actually happened was that you kept 5 people alive in a valley that we'd essentially written off with equipment that wasn't designed for what you used it for 7 hours, without losing a single one of them. And then you separated from service and came here and spent 3 years being told to stay in your lane. Emma sat with that. She didn't deflect it. She was tired of deflecting things. And there was something in Solis's directness, in the plain factual way he said it, that made deflection feel like the wrong response. She let it land. I came here to be normal, she said finally. I came here because I wanted to do the work without the context. Just nursing. Just the patients. She looked at the floor. I didn't account for the fact that the skills that made me effective in that valley also made me effective at seeing when something was wrong here, and that seeing it and saying it was going to make me a problem. The thing that makes you dangerous in a broken system, Solis said, is the same thing that makes you valuable in a functioning one. He paused. The difference is just whether the people in charge of the system have any interest in it functioning. She looked at him. He was leaning back against the pillow now. The brief effort of sustained conversation had cost something, but his eyes were still clear. Rest, she said. I will. He closed his eyes. Stay in the building today. She stood and put the chair back against the wall. At the door, she stopped. Delvera, she said. The 19-year-old. From the valley. She hadn't said the name out loud in 4 years. It came out more easily than she'd expected. Do you know what happened to him? Solis opened his eyes. He's 23 now, finished his service. He's in college in North Carolina. Engineering. A pause. He named his dog Hayes. Apparently the name stuck. Emma stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked out. Gerald Farrow was arrested at 8:49 in the morning at his home in Kellerton, a suburb 40 minutes from Silver Creek, while he was eating breakfast. The federal team reported that he had not attempted to run, had not attempted to destroy anything, had asked 3 times whether there had been a mistake, and had eventually sat down at his kitchen table and said nothing further. He was processed at the federal field office and placed in formal detention. His attorney was notified. The State Health Commission was formally informed of the situation by federal authorities at 9:15, which triggered an immediate administrative review of all institutional oversight decisions made under Farrow's authority during his tenure. 6 hospitals, 14 years of decisions. That review was going to take a long time. It was going to find things that nobody was prepared for, and it was going to be ugly in ways that would make the Riverside situation look like the beginning of the problem rather than the whole of it. Emma wasn't in the room when any of that happened. She was in the second-floor conference room with coffee that was better than what the vending machine dispensed, and 2 federal investigators, and a digital recorder, and 4 hours of very careful questions. She answered them all. She'd been a meticulous documenter for 3 years. Clinical notes, incident records, her own private logs of the dates and specific language of interactions with Grantham and Marsh and Keyes, and she had a precise, specific memory for clinical detail that came from training and from the practice of paying attention in environments where inattention had consequences. The investigators asked follow-up questions that were good ones, targeted ones, questions that told her they understood the medical context and weren't going to require her to spend 20 minutes explaining the significance of a non-blanching rash to people who'd never heard the term petechial. She talked about Abby Wren. She talked about the Metcalf patient. She talked about 7 other incidents she could document specifically, with dates, with the names of the attending physicians, with the language of the original concern and the language of the institutional response. She talked about the pattern, how it worked, how the friction was managed, how the administrative review process functioned as a tool for containing staff who created problems rather than a tool for addressing the problems they created. She talked about the trauma bay, about what she'd seen in Solis's injury pattern and why, and what she'd done about it and why. She was factual about the clinical steps, precise about the mechanism, the timeline, the decision points. She was also factual about the moment before, standing at the supply cart in a hospital she'd been suspended from, watching armed tactical personnel come through the door and choosing to stay. "Why did you stay?" one of the investigators asked. Not accusatorially, just asking. Emma thought about it. Not the diplomatic version, not the version that sounded correct. The actual answer. "Because there was a patient coming through that door," she said, "and I knew the attending staff wasn't going to see what I was going to see. And I was right. And walking away from that," she paused. "I've never been able to do that. Not when I can see it." The investigator wrote something down. The recorder kept running. She finished at 1:15 in the afternoon. She walked out of the conference room into the corridor and stood by the window for a while, watching the Silver Creek parking lot fill with cars that belonged to people who had ordinary things to do on an ordinary Thursday in February, and she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not emptiness exactly, but a quality of after, of a sustained effort that had reached its endpoint and left the body uncertain what to do with the energy that had been keeping it running. Dara found her there. She'd been formally interviewed that morning as well, and she looked like someone who had said every true thing she knew and was now inhabiting the strange lightness of a person who has been carrying weight for a long time and has finally set it down. "Abby Wren asked the floor nurses if the lady who helped her was coming to visit," Dara said. Emma looked at her. "The lady who helped her?" Apparently she told them about a nurse who came to check on her before she got sick. One of the nurses told her that nurse wasn't available right now. Dara looked at her steadily. I think you should go up. Emma went up. Abby Wren was in a pediatric wardroom on the 5th floor, in a bed that had drawings taped to the wall beside it. Her own, probably, because they were very good for a 7-year-old and very confidently signed Abby in the corner of each one. She was sitting up and she was eating Jell-O, red, with the concentration of someone applying serious effort to a serious task. Her grandmother was in the chair beside the bed, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Bernice looked up when Emma appeared in the doorway. Something in her face moved. Abby, she said quietly. Abby looked up. She had the specific alertness of a child who has recently been very sick and is now intensely aware of being better, which manifested as a quality of noticing everything. She looked at Emma for a moment with the frank, unedited assessment of a 7-year-old. You're the nurse, she said. I'm a nurse, Emma said. I don't know which one you mean. The one Grandma says helped me. She considered Emma with the directness of a person who has not yet learned to soften appraisals for social comfort. You look tired. I am tired, Emma said. She came into the room and sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, which put her at approximately Abby's eye level. How's the Jell-O? Good. They had green yesterday, but I like red better. Abby looked at her seriously. Are you okay? Emma looked at this 7-year-old girl in a hospital bed with red Jell-O on her spoon, asking Emma Hayes if she was okay. The question was simple. It was the most uncomplicated thing anyone had asked her in the last 20 hours. I'm getting there, Emma said, and meant it for the first time in a while. Work found her in the pediatric corridor at 3 p.m. He'd been on calls for most of the afternoon, coordinating, processing, managing the multiple simultaneous threads of an investigation that had expanded significantly since midnight. And he looked like someone who had expended a great deal of disciplined energy and had disciplined reserves remaining. Farrow's been formally charged, he said, of 18 counts, including obstruction, misuse of regulatory authority, and conspiracy to falsify public safety records. He paused. Keys broke at 11 this morning. Full cooperation. He gave us 4 names beyond Marsh and Farrow, 2 hospital board members who had been receiving financial reports that included the suppressed liability exposure numbers. They knew the numbers were suppressed. They asked about it once, early on, and accepted the answer they were given. Did they participate in the amendments? No, but knowing and not reporting has its own legal dimension. He looked at his tablet. Marsh's cooperation agreement is being processed. He's identified 3 additional incidents we didn't have in the original evidence, and he's provided documentation of the financial accounting that shows exactly what the liability suppression was worth. He paused. $8.3 million was a conservative estimate. The actual figure is closer to 11. Emma absorbed this. $11 million in liability exposure, managed through falsified records and a corrupted oversight relationship. Patients who had been harmed and whose harms had been invisible because the record said something different from what the nurses had written. Pratt, she asked, full immunity in exchange for cooperation. She testified this morning about 6 months of conversations with Keyes and Marsh that she'd been documenting on her own. She has audio. Rourke's expression did something brief and controlled. She recorded 11 conversations. She didn't tell Solis she was recording them because she wasn't sure he'd sanction it, and she thought she might need them anyway. He paused. She was right. Emma thought about Sylvia Pratt standing outside the recovery bay at 4:30 in the morning, trying to get to Solis before anyone arrested her for something she hadn't done. A woman who had spent 6 months gathering evidence while her credentials were being used to obscure it, who had made the decision to record conversations without telling the federal operative she was cooperating with, because she trusted her own judgment about what she was going to need. She could have come to me earlier, Emma said, when it started. She could have come to a lot of people earlier, Rourke said. So could Dara. So could Keyes on the other end of it, if he'd chosen differently. He looked at her. People make decisions in real time with incomplete information and incomplete courage. The question isn't usually, why didn't they do the right thing sooner? It's what happens when they finally do. Emma looked at him. That's not an absolution for any of it, he added. It's just an observation. "I know the difference," she said. Again. It was becoming a kind of refrain. He almost smiled. "Your suspension is being formally rescinded as of this afternoon. The administrative action is void. The authority of the administration that issued it has been compromised by the ongoing federal investigation and the hospital's interim board. They're appointing an emergency oversight committee today. Has been advised to rescind all disciplinary actions initiated by Marsh or his direct reports pending a full review." He paused. "That means you can work, if you want to." She looked at the pediatric corridor, at the drawings on the doors and the small running figures of children who were getting better, at the work that went on inside these walls regardless of what the administration was doing with the paperwork. "I want to," she said. She worked the evening shift. Nobody planned it. She didn't ask for it. The charge nurse didn't formally schedule her. It simply became the case that she was there at 5 p.m. when the shift began, and she was wearing clean scrubs that Dara had found for her, and nobody questioned it. The ER was understaffed, as it usually was in February, and there were patients who needed care, as there always were, and Emma Hayes was a nurse, which was the most relevant fact. She triaged a man with a laceration to his forearm from a kitchen accident. She assisted with a pediatric fever that was viral and managed and discharged in 2 hours. She worked alongside a new resident named Park, who was 6 months in and technically competent and personally anxious, and who needed to be told clearly and without condescension that the anxiety was normal and the competence was what mattered. "You're second-guessing the chart note," she told him, watching him hover over the workstation. "Don't. You document it accurately. Trust the documentation." He looked at her with the expression of a resident who has been told many things by many people and isn't sure which ones to believe. "How do you know when to trust it?" "When it says what you actually saw, not what you think you were supposed to see." She paused. "Document honestly. Everything else follows from that." He nodded. He went back to the chart and wrote what he'd actually seen, and it was accurate, and the attending signed off on it, and the patient went home with appropriate follow-up instructions. Small. Ordinary. The size of everything important. Grantham was on the floor. He'd been on the floor all day, quietly, without ceremony, doing his job in a department that had been turned inside out in the past 18 hours. He and Emma didn't have a conversation. They worked alongside each other in the ER's specific choreography, passing information and equipment and decisions back and forth with the professional efficiency of people who have learned to function in the same space, and at 9:15 p.m., he handed her a chart and said, "Your read first." And she gave him her read first, and he incorporated it, and they moved on. Not repaired, not resolved, but different from what it had been yesterday, in a direction that wasn't nothing. At 10 p.m., Solis asked to see her again. He was sitting up further than he'd been that morning, which was either recovery or will, probably some combination. The cardiac monitor was showing a rate in the 70s, which was better. His color was still poor, but less alarmingly so. He had a document in his hand, physical paper, printed, which seemed deliberately deliberate for a man who clearly preferred encrypted digital formats. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He handed her the document. She looked at it. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. The letterhead was federal, the language formal, the structure unfamiliar. And then it assembled itself into meaning. It was a formal commendation. Not classified. Not buried in a file that officially didn't exist. A formal, unclassified, fully documented commendation from the Joint Task Force, addressed to Emma Louise Hayes, R.N., formerly Sergeant Emma Hayes, United States Army, for actions taken on the evening of February 14th at Riverside Medical Center, Silver Creek, and for clinical and evidentiary contributions to an ongoing federal institutional accountability investigation. It named her full name, in a document that was going to be filed in a public record. And at the bottom, in the section for supplementary remarks, was a paragraph that was not standard commendation language. She could tell because it was specific in a way that templates weren't specific. It described, in plain English, what she had done in the trauma bay, what she had identified and why, what the clinical outcome had been. And then it described, in the same plain language, what her documentation over 3 years at Riverside Medical Center had contributed to a federal case that was going to result in criminal charges for multiple individuals and a systemic review of patient safety oversight across 6 institutions. Ms. Hayes's clinical records, preserved despite sustained institutional pressure to discontinue the practice, represent the evidentiary foundation upon which this investigation was built, the paragraph read. Her decision to continue filing accurate documentation in an environment actively hostile to that accuracy demonstrates a standard of professional integrity that this task force commends without reservation. She read it twice. Then she set it down on her knee and looked at the window. The night outside was clear. The clouds had broken sometime in the evening, and there were stars visible above the Silver Creek skyline, thin and cold and very far away. The classified commendation from Carvar is being unclassified, Solis said. Partially. The operational details stay buried. That's not going to change, but your role, your rank, your service record, and the commendation itself will be accessible in your official military record as of next week. He paused. You can put it on a resume if you want. You cannot put it on a resume. That's your business. But it will exist in a form that's yours to use. Emma looked at the document in her hands. You didn't have to do this tonight. I know. He looked at her. I'm doing it tonight because I've owed you it for 4 years, and I've been in a hospital bed for 16 hours. And it turns out that being in a hospital bed gives you a particular clarity about what you've been putting off. He paused. Also, the paperwork was already done. I had my team prep it before the operation. She looked at him. Before the operation. You prepared a commendation before going on an operation. I prepared several things before going on an operation I assessed as high risk. He said it without drama. It seemed like the right moment to make sure certain things were in order. She thought about the valley. About 7 hours with equipment that wasn't designed for what she used it for, and 5 people who went home because of decisions she'd made in the dark. About the debrief officer across the table in the temporary facility, asking careful questions in the particular way of someone trying to extract truth without contaminating it, and then writing a commendation that went into a file and disappeared. He'd remembered. For 4 years, in whatever capacity federal intelligence operatives carried the weight of the things they'd witnessed, he'd remembered. Thank you, she said. This time it wasn't sufficient, and she said it anyway, because it was true. 2 weeks later, the State Health Commission announced a comprehensive review of all institutional oversight activity conducted under Gerald Farrow's authority during his 14-year tenure. The announcement came with a formal acknowledgement that the Commission's internal review process had been compromised, and a commitment to independent audit of the 6 hospitals that had been under Farrow's direct oversight. 3 weeks after that, Clifton Marsh entered a formal guilty plea on 4 counts, including conspiracy to falsify medical records and obstruction of regulatory oversight. His cooperation agreement reduced his exposure significantly, but did not eliminate it. He was sentenced 4 months later to 31 months in federal prison, disbarred from hospital administration for life, and required to cooperate fully with the ongoing civil proceedings brought by patients whose care had been affected by the record alteration scheme. Roland Keyes pled guilty to 8 counts. He cooperated extensively and received a reduced sentence of 18 months, with 5 years of supervised release and a permanent bar from healthcare administration. He was, by most accounts, a man who had made a series of decisions that had begun with expedience and ended with federal detention, and he had understood this clearly and fully by the time he sat down in front of a judge. Gerald Farrow's case proceeded more slowly, as federal cases involving public officials tend to do, but it proceeded. The evidence was substantial, and the outcome, according to the federal attorneys managing it, was not in significant doubt. Sylvia Pratt returned to surgery, her cooperation was documented, her immunity was formalized, and she continued working at Riverside under the Interim Oversight Committee with the specific, slightly burdened quality of someone who knows the cost of having waited and is not going to make that particular error again. She and Emma were not friends. They were colleagues who understood each other with a precision that was its own form of respect. Grantham requested a formal review of his department's clinical escalation protocols. He submitted a 12-page proposal to the Interim Oversight Committee recommending structural changes to the nursing staff concern documentation process, including a direct-to-committee pathway for clinical disagreements that bypassed attending physician review. It was the first substantive reform proposal the committee received. They approved it in modified form 6 weeks later. Miguel Castillo was formally recognized as a contributing witness in the federal investigation. He continued working as an ER tech. He did not make a large thing of what he'd done. He was not a person who made large things of things. But there was a quality to how he moved through the department after that, which was fractionally different. A small but perceptible straightening. The posture of someone whose instinct to document had turned out to matter. Dara was offered a formal advisory role with the Interim Oversight Committee, reviewing the department's clinical documentation practices and helping to establish new standards for how nursing concerns were processed, preserved, and followed up. She took the role without ceremony. She brought the habits of a person who had been keeping careful records for 14 years and understood, in the bone-deep way of lived experience, exactly why they mattered. Abby Wren went home to her grandmother's house with a rabbit that had been to 12 countries, counting the brief and involuntary detour to a pediatric ICU. Her mother arrived from Brisbane and was told, by various hospital staff in various ways, about the nurse who had filed a concern and been suspended for it and had come back anyway. She sent a card to the nursing station. Emma read it once and put it in the drawer in her apartment where she kept things she didn't want to lose track of. The formal recognition ceremony was not something Emma had requested or expected. The Interim Oversight Committee scheduled it for the third week of March, and it was not, in the way of these things, a comfortable event. The conference room was full in a way that conference rooms at hospitals are not typically full. Oversight Committee members, federal representatives, hospital staff, 2 individuals from the Joint Task Force who were not Rourke, but who wore the same particular bearing. And there was a quality to the assembled attention that Emma found effortful in a way that the trauma bay had not been effortful. Because in the trauma bay she knew what she was doing, and in this room she was not sure where to put her hands. Rourke was there. He stood near the back, not on the committee, not at the table, present. Solis was there in a wheelchair, which he had not wanted and which his medical team had insisted upon, and which he had compromised on by arriving early enough that he was seated before most people entered, and therefore nobody saw the wheelchair situation except the people who had already been there, which was a tactical approach to an undignified circumstance that she found entirely characteristic. The committee chair, an administrator named Ferris, brought in from a federal healthcare oversight body to manage the transition, read into the record a formal summary of the investigation's findings as they pertain to Emma Hayes. The suspension, its basis, its connection to the documented pattern of administrative retaliation against clinical staff who filed safety concerns. The evidentiary role of Emma's documentation, the events in the trauma bay. And then Ferris set down the document and looked up. "I want to say something that isn't in the official record," he said. He was 60, gray, with the look of someone who had been in institutional accountability work long enough to have lost easy optimism and found something more durable in its place. What happened in this hospital happened because a system was constructed to ensure that the people who saw problems were unable to effectively report them. That system required the active participation of bad actors and the passive participation of people who had decided not to look too hard. He paused. It was undone because one person kept filing accurate documentation in an environment that was actively hostile to accurate documentation, and because another person preserved that documentation when it could have been lost, and because a third person copied 2 incident reports and kept them at home, not because they had a plan, but because something in them understood that the records mattered. He looked at Emma. Systems like the one that existed here depend on individual people deciding that the cost of telling the truth is too high. They collapse when enough people decide it isn't. The room was quiet. "Ms. Hayes," Ferris said, "the committee would like to formally offer you the position of Director of Clinical Standards and Trauma Education, a newly created role with the authority to establish and oversee clinical documentation protocols, staff concern escalation procedures, and emergency trauma training standards for this institution." He paused. "If you want it." Emma looked at the room. At the faces watching her, Dara, steady, Miguel, slightly sideways in his chair the way he held himself when he was being professional about something that was affecting him, Grantham, who met her eyes directly and without qualification, Pratt, who looked like someone sitting with a complicated accounting and doing it honestly, at Solis in his wheelchair, who looked like someone who has delivered a package across a very long distance and is now waiting to see what happens when it's opened. She thought about what she'd told the federal investigators about why she'd stayed in the trauma bay. Because there was a patient coming through the door, and she could see what the others were going to miss. That had been true in the Valley. It had been true in the ER. It was true in 3 years of clinical disagreements and carefully worded incident notes and getting told to stay in her lane. The scene wasn't the thing she'd done despite herself. It was the thing she was. The question had never been whether she had the skill. The question had been whether anyone in authority was ever going to make room for it to be used. "I want it," she said. Solis put the commendation on the table in front of him. He'd brought the formal one, the printed document, the public record, the thing that existed in a form she could use. He slid it toward the center of the table without ceremony, in the manner of someone completing a transaction that had been pending for 4 years. Emma picked it up. She didn't look at it. She'd read it twice already, and she knew what it said. She held it and looked at the room, and the room looked back at her. And for a moment, everything was very still in the particular way of a situation that has arrived at exactly where it was always going to arrive, if enough people made enough right decisions along the way. Then someone started clapping. She didn't see who. It might have been Miguel. It sounded like Miguel. And the room followed, and it was not a perfect moment. It was not the clean, cinematic resolution where everything feels finished and clear. Grantham was in that room, and she had not forgiven him, exactly. And Pratt was in that room, and the complicated arithmetic of what Pratt had and hadn't done was not yet fully resolved. And there were 231 patients whose records had been altered and whose cases were still being reviewed, and the Health Commission investigation was ongoing, and whatever came next was not going to be easy or simple or free from the weight of everything that had already happened. But the commendation was in her hands. Her name was on it, in a public record, in a form that was hers to keep. And the room was clapping for a nurse who had spent 3 years being told she wasn't worth listening to. That mattered. Not because it fixed what had been broken. It didn't. That work was longer and harder than a moment in a conference room. But because it was true. Because the truth had a different weight than the version that had been filed in the official records for years. And the difference was the whole point. And she had always known it, even when she was the only one who did. She stood in that room and held the document and let the moment be imperfect. Because that's what real things are. Imperfect, accumulated, earned by increments that are invisible in the moment and only legible in retrospect. She had not been a hero in the simple sense of the word. She had been a person who paid attention and documented accurately and refused, consistently, and at some cost, to stop believing that the record mattered. It turned out the record was everything. That was the lesson underneath all of it. Not the dramatic version with the tactical gear and the federal investigation and the drive full of evidence, but the quieter version that had been true every day for 3 years before any of that happened. That the person in the room who tells the truth and writes it down and keeps writing it down, even when no one is listening, even when the cost is real, that person is not ineffective. They are not powerless. They are building something that looks like nothing until the day it becomes the foundation for everything. Emma Hayes had built it in the margins of her nursing documentation. She had built it in the careful, clinical language of women who have learned to say "I told you so" in a way that is admissible in federal court. She walked out of that conference room with the commendation in her hand and a title she was going to earn, and the February light through the hospital windows had finally decided to become actual sunlight, pale and still cold, but present, falling across the floor in long rectangles that were warmer than they'd been yesterday. Somewhere on the 5th floor, a 7-year-old was eating Jell-O and drawing pictures with her grandmother. Somewhere in a recovery room, a federal operative was sleeping in a bed he didn't want to be in, healing at a pace he hadn't chosen, alive because someone had refused to walk away. Somewhere in the record system, 231 original documents, the real ones, the ones that said what the nurses had actually seen, were being restored to their rightful place in the file. The record mattered. It had always mattered. That was the only thing she'd ever been trying to say.